James Mitchell stood outside Oregon State Correctional Institution on a cold morning in late November 2024, breathing free air for the first time in 3 years. The 38-year-old former accountant from Portland, Oregon, United States, had walked into that prison an innocent man, framed by the one person he trusted most in the world, his wife. He'd spent 36 months replaying every moment of the trial, every piece of fabricated evidence, every lie Rachel had told under oath. But what James didn't know yet, what nobody knew, was that his release wasn't the end of his nightmare. It was the beginning of something far worse, and far better, than anything he could have imagined. The day James was arrested, he'd been celebrating his 10th wedding anniversary. He and Rachel had just finished dinner at their favorite restaurant in downtown Portland, a modest Italian place they'd been going to since they first started dating. He'd made $47,000 a year, working as a junior accountant at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized firm that handled small business accounts. Rachel worked as an executive assistant at Walsh Development Group, pulling in $38,000 annually. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District, driving a used Honda Accord, planning for the future. That future shattered when 2 police officers knocked on their door at 6 in the morning on March 15, 2021. "James Mitchell, you're under arrest for embezzlement and wire fraud," the lead officer had said, pulling James's arms behind his back while Rachel stood in their bedroom doorway, her face a perfect mask of shock and horror. "There must be some mistake," James had stammered, his mind racing. "I haven't done anything wrong." But there was no mistake, at least, not on the part of the police. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Financial records showed that over the course of 18 months, someone had systematically siphoned $380,000 from Morrison Associates client trust accounts into an offshore account. That offshore account bore James's name, his social security number, his digital signature on every transfer authorization. Bank statements showed deposits that coincided perfectly with his work schedule. Email correspondence from his work computer detailed the entire scheme. "I didn't do this," James had insisted to his lawyer, a public defender named Patricia Reeves, who looked perpetually exhausted. "Someone set me up. You have to believe me." Patricia had given him the same tired look she probably gave all her clients. "James, I've reviewed the evidence. It's not just strong, it's airtight. The DA is offering a plea deal, 7 years. You'll serve maybe 4 with good behavior. If we go to trial and lose, you're looking at 15 to 20. "But I'm innocent," James had said, his voice breaking. "Then we'll take it to trial," Patricia had replied, though her tone suggested she thought he was making a terrible mistake. If you enjoy stories of sweet revenge and justice against those who destroy innocent lives, like this video and subscribe to the channel now. There are brand new stories here every day, each one more intense than the last one you watched, and tell me where you are watching from. The trial had been a nightmare. The prosecution's case was meticulous. They presented the financial records, the offshore account, the email trail. They brought in James's supervisor, who testified that James had exclusive access to the client accounts in question. They showed the jury bank records proving that deposits to the offshore account had been made from computers inside Morrison Associates during James's shifts. And then they called Rachel to the stand. James would never forget watching his wife walk to the witness box, place her hand on the Bible, and swear to tell the truth. She'd worn a simple navy dress, her blonde hair pulled back, minimal makeup emphasizing the dark circles under her eyes, from sleepless nights, worrying about her husband's betrayal. "Mrs. Mitchell," the prosecutor had begun gently, "can you tell the jury about your husband's behavior in the months before his arrest?" Rachel had taken a shaky breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He changed. He became secretive, defensive. He'd stay late at work, claim he was handling important accounts. When I'd ask about our finances, he'd get angry, tell me not to worry about it. I thought maybe he was planning a surprise or dealing with work stress. I never imagined." Her voice had broken perfectly. "Did you notice any unusual financial activity?" "Yes," Rachel had whispered. "About 6 months before his arrest, James opened a new email account. He thought I didn't know, but I saw it on our home computer. When I asked him about it, he said it was for work, but he was so defensive. And then there were the phone calls at odd hours, the times he'd take his laptop to another room. I started to suspect he was having an affair, actually. I never thought it was something criminal. The jury had eaten it up. James had watched 12 strangers look at him with disgust and pity for his betrayed wife. His own testimony had been weak in comparison. I didn't do this. Someone must have stolen my credentials. Maybe my computer was compromised. Even to his own ears, it sounded desperate, pathetic. The verdict came back after only 4 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts. The judge had sentenced him to 12 years in Oregon State Correctional Institution. With good behavior, the parole board had suggested he might serve 6. He'd served 3 before a technicality in the evidence handling, a small procedural error by the forensics team, had gotten his sentence reduced and earned him early release. Now, standing outside those prison walls, James had one thought consuming him: Rachel. During his first year inside, he'd written her letters every week, professing his innocence, begging her to believe him, to investigate, to find the truth. She'd written back initially, brief notes about how hard this was for her, how she was struggling, how she needed time. Then the letters had stopped. His calls had gone unanswered. After 18 months, he'd received divorce papers. She'd cited irreconcilable differences in criminal conduct as grounds. She'd taken everything: their savings account, the security deposit from their apartment, even his car. He'd signed the papers. What choice did he have? But something had happened in those final months of his incarceration that changed everything. A new inmate had arrived, a white-collar criminal named Peter Hendricks, who'd worked in forensic accounting before getting caught running his own scheme. Peter had taken an interest in James's case, had reviewed the public court documents James had managed to obtain through the prison library. "This doesn't make sense," Peter had said one day in the yard, his shrewd eyes studying the financial records. "The timing is too perfect. The evidence is too clean. I've seen fabricated evidence before. I've fabricated evidence before. This has all the hallmarks." "What do you mean?" James had asked, his heart beginning to race for the first time in months. "Look at this." Peter had pointed to a series of transactions. These transfers were made at 9,047 a.m., 11:23 a.m., and 2,015 p.m. on Tuesday, March 2nd, 2021. According to your work logs, you were in meetings during all 3 of those times. Your supervisor confirmed you were present in client meetings. Yet the prosecution claimed you made these transfers from your work computer. "My lawyer mentioned that," James had said slowly, "but the IT records showed my login credentials were used." "Exactly. Your credentials, not you. Someone had your passwords, James. Someone with access to your work computer, your email, your home computer. Someone who knew your schedule intimately enough to make transfers when you were in meetings, so there'd be an alibi problem, but not a strong enough alibi to overturn the other evidence." The realization had hit James like a physical blow. "Rachel." Peter had nodded grimly. "Your wife worked as an executive assistant. She'd have basic knowledge of financial systems. And she testified she saw you using that secondary email account on your home computer. But what if she created it herself? What if she was the one accessing your work accounts? But why?" James had whispered, though deep down, he was beginning to understand. "That's what you need to find out when you get out of here," Peter had said. "And James, when you do find out, don't react emotionally. Document everything. Build a case. Be smarter than whoever did this to you." Now, clutching a plastic bag containing his few possessions, James pulled out the prepaid phone he'd had delivered to the prison the week before his release. He had $847 in his commissary account, money he'd earned over 3 years working in the prison laundry at 25 cents an hour and accepting small deposits from his elderly mother in Bend, who believed in his innocence despite everything. He had no job, no home, no car, and no life to return to. But he had something more valuable. He had time. He had nothing to lose, and he had a burning need to know the truth. James pulled up Facebook on the phone's browser, something he hadn't been able to do in 3 years. He searched for Rachel Mitchell. She'd kept his last name. Interestingly enough, her profile was public, filled with photos that made his blood run cold. There was Rachel, smiling in front of a luxury downtown Portland high-rise, keys in her hand, caption reading "New beginnings in my dream home." There was Rachel at what looked like an expensive restaurant, champagne in hand. There was Rachel in a business suit, standing in front of a Walsh Development Group banner with a man James didn't recognize. Tall, silver-haired, expensive suit, his hand resting just a little too comfortably on Rachel's lower back. James clicked on the man's tagged profile, Trevor Walsh, 45, CEO of Walsh Development Group, the same company where Rachel had worked as an executive assistant, making $38,000 a year. He scrolled through Trevor's photos. There were dozens of Rachel, going back years. Rachel at company events. Rachel on what was clearly a yacht. Rachel in business attire standing next to Trevor at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The earliest photo was dated June 2020, 9 months before James's arrest. James felt something cold and hard settling in his chest. He kept scrolling until he found a photo that made everything click into place. Rachel and Trevor together at a charity gala, dated February 14, 2021, exactly 1 month before James's arrest. The caption read, "Celebrating our partnership at the Portland Business Leaders Gala. Here's to bigger and better projects ahead." Hashtag Walsh Development, hashtag Power Couple Partnership. Power Couple. These weren't casual coworker photos. These were photos of two people who were together, who'd been together for years, who'd been together before James went to prison. They had no idea what was coming. James opened a new browser tab and searched for Walsh Development Group Portland. The company website loaded, sleek and professional, showcasing luxury real estate developments across the Pacific Northwest. The About Us page featured Trevor Walsh's bio. Trevor founded Walsh Development Group in 2008, building it into a $45 million annual revenue company, specializing in high-end commercial and residential properties. $45 million in revenue. And Trevor had been sleeping with Rachel, an executive assistant, while she was married to James, while James was making $47,000 a year as an accountant. The pieces were falling into place. A wealthy CEO having an affair with a married employee. An inconvenient husband who needed to disappear. A wife with access to her husband's work computer, his passwords, his email accounts. A wife who testified against him, who'd played the role of shocked, betrayed spouse perfectly. James felt a cold rage building inside him. But he remembered Peter's words, "Don't react emotionally. Document everything. Build a case. Be smarter than whoever did this to you." He opened a notes app on his phone and began typing everything he remembered, every detail, every timeline, every piece of evidence that hadn't made sense at his trial. Then he opened a new search. Private Investigators, Portland, Oregon. He had $847. He had nothing. He had everything to fight for. James Mitchell was out of prison, and the people who'd put him there had no idea that the man they'd destroyed was about to become their worst nightmare. They'd taken 3 years of his life, his reputation, his career, his freedom. Now it was time to take everything from them. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was up against. And as James looked at photos of Rachel and Trevor living their best life while he'd rotted in a cell for crimes he didn't commit, he realized something crucial. His revenge wouldn't be hot and impulsive. It would be cold, calculated, and absolutely devastating. The day James Mitchell was released from prison, something happened. Something that would change his life and the lives of Rachel and Trevor Walsh forever. He just didn't know it yet. James spent his first night of freedom in a motel off Interstate 5, a rundown place called the Riverside Inn that charged $39 a night and didn't ask questions. He lay on the scratchy comforter, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and made a plan. The next morning, he took a bus to the Oregon Employment Department office in downtown Portland. His parole officer, a stern woman named Miss Rodriguez, had made it clear he needed to find legitimate employment within 30 days or risk violating his parole. The irony wasn't lost on James. He'd lost his accounting license as a convicted felon, meaning the career he'd spent years building was gone. He'd have to start over doing manual labor or retail work. But first, he needed information. At a public library computer, James created a new email address and began methodically researching. He searched property records and discovered that Rachel Mitchell now owned a condominium in the prestigious Vista Pearl Tower, a 20-story luxury building where units started at $680,000. She'd purchased it in May 2022, 14 months after his incarceration, paying cash. Cash. On an executive assistant's salary. James's hands trembled as he pulled up the deed transfer. The property had been purchased through an LLC called Pacific Heights Investments. More searching revealed that Pacific Heights Investments was registered to Trevor Walsh as the managing member. Trevor had bought Rachel a $680,000 condo while James was in prison. James dug deeper into Walsh Development Group's corporate filings, business licenses, and public records. The company had exploded in the past 3 years, acquiring prime development sites across Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. Their flagship project, Walsh Towers, a mixed-use development in downtown Portland, had broken ground in August 2021, just 5 months after James's conviction. Something Peter had said echoed in James's mind: follow the money. If Rachel and Trevor had framed him, there had to be a reason beyond just getting James out of the way. Trevor Walsh was a millionaire CEO. He could have simply had an affair. Rachel could have simply filed for divorce. Why risk a complex fraud scheme? Unless the money James was accused of stealing, $380,000, had actually been used for something specific. James pulled up the timeline again. The alleged embezzlement had occurred between September 2019 and March 2021. Walsh Development Group had been bidding on the downtown development project during that same period. James searched for news articles about the project and found a Portland Business Journal piece from July 2020. Walsh Development edges out competitors for prime downtown site. CEO credits strategic cash position for winning bid. Strategic cash position. $380,000 would have been a significant cash infusion for a bidding war, especially if Trevor needed to move quickly without tying up credit lines or alerting business partners to the affair that was funding his bid. James felt his pulse quicken. They hadn't just framed him to get him out of the way. They'd used him to steal money, funnel it through the offshore account under his name, and finance Trevor's business deals. James had been a patsy, a fall guy, a convenient scapegoat whose credentials and access Rachel could exploit. But proving it was another matter entirely. James left the library and walked 12 blocks to a small legal aid office in Old Town. The receptionist, a young woman with bright pink hair, looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak with an attorney," James said. "I'm a convicted felon trying to prove my innocence." The woman's expression shifted from polite to skeptical. "We primarily handle civil matters, tenant disputes, family law, that sort of thing. Overturning a criminal conviction requires an appeals attorney or someone who specializes in post-conviction relief." "I can't afford that," James said flatly. "I just got out of prison 3 days ago. I have $783 to my name. But I have evidence that I was framed, and I need advice on what to do with it." The woman studied him for a long moment. "Wait here." She disappeared into a back office. 10 minutes later, she returned with a tired-looking man in his 50s, wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt and wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Jeffrey Chen. No relation to any Chen you might know," he said, extending his hand. "I'm an attorney here. Emily says you have an interesting situation." "I was framed for embezzlement by my ex-wife and her lover," James said. "They used my credentials to steal money from my employer, funneled it through an offshore account in my name, and used it to fund his business. I can prove the timeline, but I need help understanding how to build a legal case." Geoffrey's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious allegation. What evidence do you have?" James pulled out his phone and showed Geoffrey everything he'd compiled: the property records, the timeline of Walsh Development Group's expansion, the photos of Rachel and Trevor together before James's arrest, the discrepancy in the transaction times Peter had identified. Geoffrey studied the information carefully, his expression growing increasingly interested. "This is circumstantial," he said finally, "but it's compelling. The problem is, you've already been convicted. Overturning a conviction requires new evidence, something that wasn't available at trial. or prosecutorial misconduct, or constitutional violations. What you have here suggests motive and opportunity, but it doesn't definitively prove you didn't commit the crime. So, what do I do? James asked, feeling his hope deflating. You need to prove they had access to your credentials and actively use them to frame you, Jeffrey said. That means you need documentation, emails, text messages, bank records that show the money flowing from the offshore account to Trevor Walsh or Rachel. You need evidence that explicitly links them to the crime. How do I get that? Jeffrey leaned back in his chair. Legally? You'd need a subpoena, which requires convincing a judge you have grounds for a new investigation. That's nearly impossible without a lawyer, and a lawyer costs money you don't have. Illegally? I can't advise you on that. But I can tell you that if you somehow obtained evidence of a crime, say if you found emails proving they framed you, and you turn that evidence over to the police, they'd be obligated to investigate. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel if you have not, because the ending of this story will blow your mind. And drop a comment below telling me what you think James should do next. James left the legal aid office with more questions than answers. He couldn't legally access Rachel or Trevor's private communications. He couldn't hack into their accounts. He couldn't break into their homes or offices. But there had to be something, some angle he hadn't considered. He spent the next week working day labor jobs, loading trucks, moving furniture, cleaning out foreclosed homes, to scrape together money. Each night he returned to the Riverside Inn and continued his research. He created a detailed dossier on Rachel and Trevor, learning their routines, their habits, their lives. Rachel worked Monday through Friday at Walsh Development Group, which had offices in a modern glass building in the Pearl District. She left work around 5:30 each evening, usually stopping at a Whole Foods before heading home to her luxury condo. On weekends, she attended yoga classes at a boutique studio and had brunch with friends at trendy restaurants. Trevor's schedule was more erratic. He traveled frequently for business, drove a silver Mercedes S-Class, and lived in a modern mansion in the West Hills overlooking the city. A property worth an estimated $3.2 million, according to public records. James also discovered something interesting. Rachel and Trevor weren't public about their relationship. Her social media showed them together at business events, but always framed as colleagues. Trevor's posts never mentioned Rachel at all. To the outside world, they maintained a professional distance, which meant their affair, even now, was a secret worth protecting. On his 9th day of freedom, James was moving furniture for an estate sale company when he overheard a conversation between two workers. "Yeah, my sister works it for some big development company downtown," one of them said. "She says the CEO is paranoid about cybersecurity after they had a breach last year. Makes everyone change passwords every 30 days. Requires two-factor authentication, the whole deal." James's ears perked up. "What company?" he asked casually. "Walsh something." "Walsh Development?" "She complains about it constantly." That evening, James searched for news about a cybersecurity breach at Walsh Development Group. He found a small article from March 2023, 2 years after his arrest, mentioning that the company had experienced a minor data security incident requiring password resets for all employees. An idea began forming in James's mind. If Walsh Development had experienced a breach, they would have investigated it. There would be IT logs, security reports, maybe even forensic analysis of which accounts were compromised and when. If James could access those reports, they might show a pattern of suspicious activity, especially if Rachel's account had been used to access financial systems around the time of the embezzlement. But how could he get access to internal IT security reports? The answer came to him 3 days later when he saw a job posting on Craigslist. Walsh Development Group seeking temporary janitorial staff for night shift deep cleaning. $18 hour. Background check required. James stared at the posting. A background check would reveal his conviction, which would disqualify him from most positions. But janitorial work for a temporary deep cleaning contract? Many companies hired convicted felons for that kind of work, especially if they were desperate for staff. He applied, using his real name and being upfront about his conviction. To his surprise, he received a call the next afternoon. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Brenda from Walsh Development Group HR," a pleasant voice said. "We received your application for the janitorial position. I see you have a conviction on your record. Can you tell me a bit about that?" James had prepared for this. "I was convicted of financial crimes," he said carefully. "I served 3 years and was released 2 weeks ago. I'm looking for honest work to rebuild my life. I understand if the conviction is disqualifying, but I'm a hard worker and I need this opportunity." There was a pause. "The position doesn't involve handling money or accessing sensitive areas," Brenda said. "It's strictly cleaning offices after hours under supervision. We're willing to give people second chances. Can you start Monday?" James almost laughed at the irony. The company that had destroyed his life was now going to hire him and give him access to their building. "Yes," he said. "Absolutely. Thank you." His first night at Walsh Development Group, James arrived at 9 p.m. wearing the provided uniform, dark blue coveralls and a company ID badge that said contract cleaning staff. He was part of a crew of 6 people, supervised by a crew chief named Luis, who explained their duties. Vacuum all carpeted areas, empty trash bins, clean bathrooms and kitchens, wipe down desks and surfaces. Don't touch computers, don't open drawers, don't mess with papers on desks, Luis said firmly. We're here to clean, not snoop. We lose contracts when people snoop. James nodded obediently. The Walsh development offices were exactly what he'd expected. Sleek, modern, expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Portland, glass conference rooms, abstract art on the walls. He pushed his cleaning cart through the corridors, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces, his mind working constantly. On his third night, James was assigned to clean the executive floor. Trevor Walsh's office was at the end of a long corridor, a massive space with leather furniture, and a desk that probably cost more than James used to make in a year. Rachel's workspace was visible from the corridor, a large desk outside Trevor's door, typical for an executive assistant, though executive assistant clearly meant something different for Rachel than it did for most people. James cleaned methodically, his eyes scanning everything. He couldn't access computers or files without triggering security alerts, but he could observe. He noted the layout, the security cameras, the locked cabinets, the way things were organized. On his fourth night, James made his move. He'd noticed that the IT department was on the 3rd floor, a separate secured area that the cleaning crew accessed last. The IT manager, a young guy in his 20s named Kyle, often worked late and was still there when the cleaning crew arrived. Rough day? James asked conversationally as he emptied the trash bin next to Kyle's desk. Kyle looked up, bleary-eyed. System migration. We're moving everything to a new cloud infrastructure, and of course nothing is working right. Sounds stressful, James said sympathetically. How long have you worked here? 4 years, Kyle said, rubbing his eyes. Since right after college. It's usually not this bad, but with the expansion and everything, the workload is insane. Expansion? James asked, maintaining his casual tone. Yeah, we've grown like crazy the past few years. The CEO is always pushing for bigger projects, more development sites. More growth means more systems, more security protocols, more headaches for me. James nodded. Security must be important in your industry. Oh man, you have no idea, Kyle said, leaning back in his chair. We had a breach a couple years ago, nothing major, but it scared everyone. Now I have to run quarterly security audits, monitor access logs, the whole 9 yards. I've probably generated 1,000 reports in the past 3 years. James felt his heart rate increase. Reports on what? Access patterns, anomalies, suspicious login activity. Basically anything that might indicate a compromised account or insider threat. It's mostly CS stuff. Cover your ass. But the CEO insists on it. Do you keep all those reports? James asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Kyle gestured to a filing cabinet in the corner. All the electronic logs are backed up on our servers, but the physical copies are in there. Company policy requires paper backups of all security documentation. I keep telling them it's redundant, but lawyers, you know? That night, James lay awake in his motel room, his mind racing. Those security reports would show access patterns for every employee account, including Rachel's. If she'd used her access to get into systems she shouldn't have accessed, if there was any digital footprint of her activities before James's arrest, it would be in those reports. But the filing cabinet was locked. The IT office was monitored by cameras, and James was a convicted felon on parole, working a janitorial job. If he got caught stealing documents, he'd go straight back to prison. Still, those reports might be the evidence Jeffrey Chen had said he needed. They might prove Rachel had access systems beyond her authorization. They might show the digital trail of the frame-up. James had spent 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He'd lost everything. His career, his freedom, his reputation. 3 years of his life. Rachel and Trevor had done this to him, had used him and destroyed him without a second thought, all while building their fortune and living in luxury. The question wasn't whether James would take the risk. The question was how. What happened next would either free him or destroy him completely. James Mitchell was about to cross a line he could never uncross. But after everything they'd taken from him, he had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. James spent the next 2 weeks studying the IT office layout, Kyle's schedule, and the building's security protocols. He learned that the security cameras recorded everything, but were only actively monitored during business hours. At night, they recorded to a server that was reviewed only if an incident occurred. He learned that Kyle typically left by 10 p.m. on weeknights, and that the cleaning crew had a narrow window between 10,015 and 10,045 when they cleaned the IT office before moving to the lower floors. He also learned that Kyle, despite being security conscious professionally, was remarkably trusting personally. On James's 10th night at Walsh Development, Kyle had locked his filing cabinet and then immediately complained about forgetting where he'd put the key, before finding it in his desk drawer, a shallow drawer with a simple lock that could be jimmied with a paperclip. James didn't act impulsively. Peter Hendricks had taught him to be methodical, to plan, to think 3 steps ahead. So James waited, watched, and prepared. On December 18, 2024, exactly 23 days after his release from prison, James made his move. That night, he arrived for his shift as usual. The crew went through their routine, and at 10:12 p.m., James was assigned to the IT office. Kyle had left 10 minutes earlier. James worked quickly, emptying trash, wiping surfaces, his heart pounding. When Luis's voice crackled over the crew's walkie-talkies, moving to floor 2, everyone check in, James responded affirmatively, then quietly locked the IT office door from inside. He had maybe 7 minutes before someone noticed his absence. James moved to the filing cabinet, pulled a paperclip from his pocket, and worked at the desk drawer lock. It clicked open in 15 seconds. The filing cabinet key was exactly where Kyle always kept it. James unlocked the cabinet, his hands shaking slightly, and found what he was looking for. Security audit reports, organized by quarter, dating back 4 years. He grabbed the reports from Q4 2019 through Q1 2021, the entire period of the alleged embezzlement. Each report was 30 to 40 pages of dense technical data. He couldn't photograph them all in the time he had, and he couldn't risk taking them without being caught on camera. Then James remembered something Kyle had mentioned. Electronic logs were backed up on the servers. He moved to Kyle's computer. It was locked, password protected. But James had been watching Kyle type his password for 2 weeks, had seen the pattern of his finger movements. He tried what he thought he'd seen, KYLE2020WALSH. The computer unlocked. James's pulse was racing now. He navigated to the shared drive where security reports were stored, found the same quarterly reports, and began downloading them to a USB drive he'd purchased at a convenience store that morning. The files were large. Each report was hundreds of megabytes of detailed access logs. 2 minutes. 3. 4. His walkie-talkie crackled. "Mitchell, where are you?" "IT office, almost done," James responded, keeping his voice steady. 5 minutes. 6. The download completed. James pulled out the USB drive, locked it in his pocket, logged out of Kyle's computer, carefully returned the key to the drawer, and unlocked the office door. He grabbed his cleaning cart and emerged into the corridor just as Luis appeared around the corner. "You okay?" Luis asked, frowning. "You're taking longer than usual." "Sorry," James said. "Coffee spilled by the filing cabinet. Wanted to clean it properly." Luis nodded, apparently satisfied, and they moved on to the next floor. James finished his shift at 2 a.m., collected his pay, and left Walsh Development Group for what he thought might be the last time. He went directly to a 24-hour copy shop, used their computer to upload the files to a secure cloud storage account, made multiple copies on different USB drives, and stored them in separate locations. Then he went back to his motel room and began reading. The security reports were dense, technical, filled with timestamps and account identifiers and access patterns that would mean nothing to most people. But James had been an accountant. He understood data. And what he found in those reports was a roadmap of the crime that had destroyed his life. In September 2019, Rachel Mitchell's account had begun accessing financial systems she'd never accessed before, specifically the client management portal that James used to process trust account transfers. The access was sporadic at first, once every few weeks, always during business hours when James would be in meetings or away from his desk. In December 2019, a secondary email account had been created using Rachel's workstation. An account registered to jmmitchell.consulting@protonmail.com, the same offshore email that had been used in James's trial as evidence of his guilt. In January 2020, Rachel's account had accessed the password management system that stored encrypted credentials for various company systems. The logs showed multiple attempts to access James's saved passwords. And then, between February 2020 and March 2021, there were hundreds of instances of Rachel's account accessing Morrison Associates' client portal, the system James used for his job, always during times when James was documented as being in meetings, on lunch breaks, or out of the office. The embezzlement hadn't been done by James. It had been done by Rachel, using his credentials, from her computer at Walsh Development Group, carefully timing each transaction to create the appearance that James was responsible, while being careful to do it when he had a weak alibi, present in the building but not at his desk. James had his evidence. But evidence alone wasn't enough. He needed to prove that Rachel had used this access to steal the money and funnel it to Trevor Walsh. That's where things got more complicated. James reached out to Jeffrey Chen at the legal aid office, bringing printed copies of the security reports with identifying information redacted. "How did you obtain these?" Jeffrey asked, studying the documents carefully. "I can't tell you that," James said. "But they're legitimate. They show that my ex-wife's account was used to access my work systems during the entire period of the alleged embezzlement." Jeffrey flipped through the pages, his expression growing increasingly focused. "This is significant. This could potentially form the basis for a motion for a new trial, or at least warrant a new investigation. But I have concerns about how you obtained this. If you found evidence of a crime," James said carefully, "aren't you obligated to report it?" "If I have reasonable belief that a crime occurred, yes," Jeffrey said slowly. "But James, if you obtained this illegally—" "I didn't break into anywhere," James said, which was technically true. He'd been authorized to be in that office, authorized to clean that space. He just hadn't been authorized to access the computer or download files. These documents exist. They're real. They show a pattern of criminal behavior. What you do with that information is up to you." Jeffrey studied him for a long moment. "Give me a week," he said finally. "I need to think about how to handle this." But James wasn't willing to wait a week. He wasn't willing to trust the system that had already failed him once. If he'd learned anything from prison, from Peter Hendricks, from 3 years of having his life stolen, it was that sometimes you had to take justice into your own hands. Not through violence, not through revenge, but through information. James created an anonymous email account and composed a message to the Portland Police Department's Financial Crimes Division. The Oregon State Bar, which regulated attorneys like those at Morrison & Associates. and the FBI's white-collar crime unit. He attached the security reports along with a detailed explanation of what they showed, the timeline of his case, and evidence of Rachel and Trevor's relationship. He included property records showing how Rachel had acquired a $680,000 condo shortly after James's conviction, purchased through Trevor Walsh's LLC. He included photographs from social media showing Rachel and Trevor together before James's arrest. He included a detailed timeline showing how Walsh Development Group had used a strategic cash position to win a major development contract within months of James's conviction for embezzling the exact amount of money that would have provided such a cash position. "I am the victim of a sophisticated frame-up," James wrote. "The evidence shows that Rachel Mitchell, working with Trevor Walsh, systematically accessed my work accounts to embezzle funds that were then used to finance Walsh Development Group's business ventures. I was convicted and imprisoned for crimes they committed. I am requesting a full investigation into this matter and a review of my conviction." He hit send at 3:47 a.m. on December 22, 2024. Then he waited. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you would have done in James's situation. The response came faster than James expected. Within 48 hours, Jeffrey Chen called him. "The Dawes office just contacted me," Jeffrey said, his voice tense with excitement. "Someone sent them a comprehensive package of evidence suggesting prosecutorial oversight in your case. They're opening an investigation." "James, this is huge. They're talking about potentially vacating your conviction pending the investigation results." "What does that mean?" James asked, his hands trembling. "It means if the investigation confirms what this evidence suggests, your conviction could be overturned. You could be exonerated. Officially declared innocent." James felt tears pricking his eyes for the first time in 3 years. "When will they know?" "These things take time," Jeffrey cautioned. "Months, possibly. But they're taking it seriously. The evidence is compelling enough that they've already started interviewing people at Walsh Development Group. They've subpoenaed financial records from Trevor Walsh's company. This is really happening. It took 4 months. 4 months of investigation, interviews, forensic accounting, and digital forensics analysis. 4 months of Rachel and Trevor being questioned, their accounts being scrutinized, their relationship being exposed. 4 months of the life James had lost slowly being returned to him. The breakthrough came when forensic investigators accessed the offshore account that had been created in James's name. The account had been opened using Rachel's IP address from Walsh Development Group's offices. The initial deposit, $380,000, had been transferred in installments over 18 months, matching exactly the embezzlement timeline. And the account had been emptied in March 2021, 2 days after James's arrest, with the funds transferred to an account controlled by Pacific Heights Investments, Trevor Walsh's LLC. The entire scheme unraveled like pulling a thread from a sweater. Rachel, faced with irrefutable evidence and the prospect of decades in prison, accepted a plea deal. She provided detailed testimony about how Trevor had convinced her to help him frame James. How Trevor had needed cash for the downtown development project, but couldn't access it without alerting his business partners or banks. How they'd planned every detail of the embezzlement and frame-up together. Trevor said it was a victimless crime. Rachel testified in a deposition that James watched from the Dawes office. She looked smaller than he remembered, diminished, her expensive clothes and perfect makeup unable to hide the fear in her eyes. He said the insurance would cover Morrison and Associates' losses. He said James would serve a few years at most, and by the time he got out, we'd be so wealthy we could compensate him. It was supposed to be temporary. "But you testified against your husband at trial," the prosecutor said. "You portrayed yourself as a victim of his deception." Rachel's voice cracked. "Trevor coached me. We practiced my testimony for weeks. He said if I played the shocked wife convincingly, they'd never suspect me. And it worked. Until now." Trevor Walsh's downfall was spectacular in public. The investigation revealed that he'd used embezzled funds for multiple business deals, that his company's rapid expansion had been built on stolen money, that his entire financial empire was compromised. The FBI seized his assets pending criminal proceedings. Walsh Development Group stock, they'd gone public in 2023, crashed. Investors filed lawsuits. Business partners fled. Within 6 weeks of the investigation going public, Trevor Walsh went from multimillionaire CEO to bankrupt criminal defendant. His mansion was foreclosed, his Mercedes repossessed, his company dissolved in bankruptcy. The downtown development project, Walsh Towers, the crown jewel he'd stolen $380,000 to build, was sold at auction to pay creditors. On April 15, 2025, nearly 4 years after his arrest, James Mitchell stood in a Portland courtroom and heard a judge say the words he dreamed of for 3 years. The court finds that James Mitchell was wrongfully convicted based on fabricated evidence. The conviction is hereby vacated, and all charges are dismissed. Mr. Mitchell, you are innocent. On behalf of the state of Oregon, I apologize for the injustice you suffered. James closed his eyes, let the words wash over him, and allowed himself to cry. Rachel Mitchell pleaded guilty to embezzlement, fraud, and perjury. She was sentenced to 12 years in Oregon State Correctional Institution, exactly what James had been sentenced to. The judge denied her request for a reduced sentence. You didn't just steal money, the judge said at her sentencing. You stole a man's life, his freedom, his reputation. You looked him in the eye at his trial and lied, knowing he would be imprisoned for your crimes. This court views that betrayal as among the most egregious acts that can be committed in our justice system. Trevor Walsh went to trial and was convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. Neither would be eligible for parole for at least a decade. James received a wrongful conviction settlement from the state of Oregon, $94,000 per year of wrongful imprisonment, totaling $282,000 for his 3 years. Morrison and Associates, horrified by their role in the frame-up, settled a civil lawsuit for an additional $850,000. Trevor Walsh's bankruptcy estate paid $190,000 as partial restitution. For the first time in his adult life, James Mitchell had financial security. More importantly, he had his innocence back. His record was expunged, his accounting license restored, his reputation cleared. But the money and vindication weren't what mattered most to James. What mattered was the letter he received 6 months after his exoneration, forwarded by his lawyer. It was from Peter Hendricks, the former inmate who'd first helped James see the truth about his case. James, the letter read, I heard about your case on the news. I'm so damn proud of you, man. You did exactly what I told you to do. You stayed smart, gathered evidence, and let the truth speak for itself. You got justice without becoming the bad guy. That takes strength. That takes character. You're going to be okay. Better than okay. You're going to help a lot of people who went through what we went through. I know it. Stay strong. Peter James folded the letter carefully and sat in the small but comfortable apartment he now rented in Northeast Portland, looking out at the city lights. He thought about the past 4 years, the betrayal, the prison time, the investigation, the vindication. He thought about Rachel and Trevor, now in prison themselves, facing the consequences of what they'd done. He felt no satisfaction in their suffering, which surprised him. He'd expected to feel triumph, vindication, even joy at their downfall. Instead, he felt something quieter. Peace. James had learned something profound in those years of injustice and investigation. He'd learned that revenge wasn't about making others suffer. It was about revealing truth, restoring justice, and ensuring that people faced the natural consequences of their actions. He hadn't destroyed Rachel and Trevor. They'd destroyed themselves. He'd simply held up a mirror to their crimes. He'd also learned that rebuilding a life after devastation wasn't about returning to what you'd lost. It was about becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who understood both the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. James Mitchell started a nonprofit organization called Second Chance Evidence Project, helping wrongfully convicted individuals access the resources and legal support needed to prove their innocence. He worked with forensic accountants, its security experts, and attorneys to analyze cases, identify inconsistencies, and build appeals. In the first year alone, the organization helped exonerate 3 people who'd been wrongfully imprisoned. One of them had served 14 years for a crime he didn't commit. When that man walked out of prison, tears streaming down his face, James was there to meet him. "How do you move forward?" the man asked James. "How do you let go of the anger?" James thought carefully before responding. "You don't let go of the anger," he said. "You transform it. You use it as fuel to ensure other people don't suffer what you suffered. You turn injustice into justice, not by seeking revenge, but by preventing future wrongs. That's how you win." The man nodded, understanding passing between them. The understanding of 2 people who'd walked through hell and emerged transformed. Sometimes late at night, James still thought about the moment he stood outside Oregon State Correctional Institution, breathing free air for the first time in 3 years, knowing his life had been destroyed by lies. He thought about the rage, the despair, the desire for revenge that had consumed him. But he also thought about the choice he'd made, not to become the monster they'd painted him as, but to become the man who proved that truth, patience, and intelligence could triumph over deception, wealth, and power. James Mitchell had been sent to prison for something he never did. The day he was released, something happened. Not something simple or dramatic, but something profound. He chose who he would become in response to injustice. And that choice, more than any courtroom vindication, more than any settlement, more than seeing his enemies imprisoned, was what truly set him free. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and leave a comment telling me what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get alerts for new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.